That rainy night, Evan just wanted to get his old truck down the empty highway and back to his little cabin in the woods, away from people and the war memories that never quite let go. Then his K9 partner in the passenger seat suddenly growled, forcing him to swerve toward a burning car where an elderly woman in a red coat was trapped and shaking. He thought he was just doing the last decent thing he still knew how to do. He had no idea that pulling her out of that storm would lead to a meeting that shook the whole town and to a simple thank you big enough to change its future. Shapia? The storm rolled over Cedar Ridge like it had a personal grudge against the little town. Rain hammered the old two-lane highway, turning the faded white lines into pale ghosts under the headlights. Wind shoved at the battered pickup as if it wanted it off the road and into the trees. Evan Miller leaned forward over the wheel, jaw tight, wipers beating uselessly at the sheets of water. The dash clock glowed past midnight. His shoulders ached from the long day at the shop, but he preferred the late drive home to the silence of his rented room in town. Out here, with the pines crowding both sides of the road and the sky ripping open with lightning, at least the noise matched the way his head felt most nights. Beside him, Shadow sat with the stillness of a soldier on watch. The German shepherd's sable coat was a moving pattern of light and dark under the flashes, amber eyes steady on the road ahead. He didn't pant, didn't whine, didn't fuss. Just watched. When thunder cracked, his ears twitched, but he didn't flinch. He had heard worse in uniform. "Almost home, buddy," Evan muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "Storm will blow over. They always do." Shadow's tail swept once against the cracked vinyl seat. Then, as the truck climbed a shallow rise and the highway curved left between tall pines, something in the dog changed. His body went rigid. A low sound started deep in his chest, a growl that curled up between the beats of the wipers and the roar of the rain. Evan's hands tightened on the wheel. "What is it?" The growl deepened. Shadow shifted forward, front paws braced on the edge of the seat, head craning toward the darkness beyond the windshield. His stare fixed on something ahead long before Evan's human eyes could see it. Lightning cracked open the sky, bright and brutal, and for a split second the world lit up white. That was when Evan saw the car, a silver sedan, sideways across the road, nose buried in the ditch, rear end twisted toward the trees. One headlight flickered weakly, cutting a crooked circle through the rain. Steam boiled from under the crushed hood, already turning darker, meaner, as it curled into the night. "Damn," Evan breathed. He hit the brakes. The pickup skidded, tires surfing a skin of water before catching with a rough jerk. The truck stopped at an angle, hazard lights clicking to life with a hollow tick-tick-tick. Shadow barked, sharp and urgent, the sound punching through the storm. Evan shoved his door open. The rain hit like a wall, cold and solid, soaking his shirt in seconds. Gravel and water splashed under his boots as he ran toward the sedan. The smell of hot metal and leaking fluids cut through the wet pine air. "Hello?" he shouted. "Anybody in there?" Lightning flashed again. Through the cracked windshield, he saw her. An older woman slumped against the deployed airbag, silver hair plastered against her cheeks. A long, red coat was twisted around her like it was trying to hold her together. One of her shoes was gone, the other sat crooked on the brake pedal. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the seatbelt, breath fogging the inside of the glass. "I see you," Evan yelled. "Stay with me, ma'am. I'm coming around." Flames snaked out from under the hood, small at first, then feeding greedily on whatever they could find. The rain fought them, but it wasn't winning fast enough. Shadow circled the wreck, barking in short bursts, keeping just out of reach of the smoke, his instincts calculating danger and time in a way training could never fully explain. The driver's side door wouldn't budge. Evan dug his fingers into the handle, and yanked until his shoulders screamed. Metal groaned, but held. He swore under his breath, shifted his grip, planted his feet in the mud, and pulled like he was dragging a wounded buddy out of a blast zone. On the second heave, the frame gave a few inches. On the third, it snapped open with a shriek that vanished into the thunder. He leaned in. The woman's eyes flew to his. They were wide and wild, but there was something clear in them too, something stubborn. "Ma'am, I've got you," he said, voice steady in a way he'd learned the hard way. "I'm going to get you out. Can you move your legs?" She nodded in a shaky way, breath coming ragged. Up close, Evan could see the fine lines at the corners of her mouth, the kind that came from years of holding herself together in public. The stormlight found a small gold ring on her right hand, worn and thin. "Seat belt first," he said, fingers working the buckle. It popped free. As he slid an arm behind her back, a crack of thunder tore across the sky. She flinched so hard her whole body jolted. A sound escaped her that wasn't just fear, it was old, deep, torn out of something buried. "No," she gasped. "Not again, not again. Daniel—" The name hit him like a slap. For a heartbeat, his grip stumbled. Daniel. Of all the names in the world, it had to be that one. "Eyes on me," he said quickly. "Look at me, not the storm. I've got you, all right? We're not doing this again, not tonight." Her gaze locked on his. For a moment, the thunder and the rain fell away. It was just his face, her panic, and the steady weight of Shadow's bark behind him, counting down seconds they didn't have. Evan lifted her, surprised at how light she was. Beneath the heavy coat, she felt fragile, bird-boned, trembling down to the muscles in her fingers. She clung to his shoulders as he backed away from the burning car. Shadow moved with them, body angled toward the heat, shielding without touching. They were 20 feet away when the sedan went up. The explosion threw a wave of heat across Evan's back, bright and violent, followed by a roar that reminded him too much of nights he didn't talk about. The woman cried out and buried her face against his chest. He twisted, putting his body between her and the debris, muscles braced for impact that didn't come. Shards of glass pattered into the water. The fire climbed higher, then began to collapse into itself. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe. It's over." It was a lie, but sometimes people needed to hear it before it was true. He got her into the passenger seat of the truck, adjusting the seat back and blasting the heater. Shadow jumped in behind them, shaking rain from his coat before settling on the floorboard, head pushed up between the seats, eyes never leaving the woman's face. For a while, all she did was breathe and tremble. The storm hammered the roof, steam hung in the air, and Evan's heart tried to find a normal rhythm again. "My name is Evan," he said softly. "Evan Miller. This is Shadow." She swallowed, lips pale. "Margaret," she whispered. "Margaret Hayes." Her voice had the faintly polished sound of someone used to speaking in boardrooms or church meetings, but tonight it was shredded thin by fear. When thunder rolled again in the distance, her shoulders jerked as if someone had struck her. Shadow did something he almost never did with strangers. He eased closer and laid one paw gently on her knee. Margaret froze. Her gaze dropped to the paw, then lifted up into the dog's eyes. Whatever she saw there made the color drain from her face. "Those eyes," she breathed. "Dear Lord, I've seen those eyes in a storm like this before." Evan felt the back of his neck prickle. "Maybe you hit your head, ma'am. We'll get you checked out. Nearest clinic's closed this late, so I'm taking you to my place. It's close, safe. Tomorrow, we'll sort everything else." Margaret didn't answer right away. She leaned her head back against the seat, still holding on to the edge of Shadow's paw like it was an anchor. 30 years ago," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "It rained like this. The thunder sounded just like tonight. I walked away. My family didn't." Evan didn't push. He knew the sound of a door cracking open on a room full of ghosts. You didn't fling it wide. You waited, let the person decide how much light they could stand. He drove slow through the storm, wipers straining, eyes flicking between the road and the woman in the seat beside him. Her red coat steamed gently in the warm air. Shadow's breath was arty, steady rhythm between them. By the time they turned onto the narrow gravel drive that led to his small cabin in the trees, the worst of the wind had passed. Rain still poured, but it had lost some of its rage. Inside, the cabin glowed with the soft light of a single lamp and the orange flicker of the fireplace Evan coaxed back to life. He draped a heavy blanket around Margaret's shoulders and set a mug of hot water with lemon in her hands. She held it like she wasn't sure she trusted its warmth. Shadow settled at her feet, curling his body so that one side of him touched the toe of her shoe. His ears relaxed, but his eyes stayed alert. "Why?" she started, staring into the fire. "Why would a stranger stop in that storm? Why risk your life for someone you don't know?" Evan sat down across from her, elbows on his knees, fingers laced loosely. "Because somebody did that for me once," he said quietly. "Out in a place where storms don't have rain. Didn't make it home, but I did. Feels wrong not to pass it along." Margaret's eyes met his again. The panic was still there, but underneath it, something gentler was trying to surface. "You pulled me out of the storm," she said. "I won't forget that, Mr. Miller." He shook his head. "Evan's fine. Get some rest. We can talk in the morning when the ground's not trying to float away." She nodded slowly, drained the cup in small, careful sips, then let her head sink back into the couch cushion. Within minutes, exhaustion dragged her under. The storm outside kept raging, but inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Shadow's steady breathing as he watched over her. Evan stood by the window, looking out at the dark line of pines. Somewhere behind them, the burned-out skeleton of her car still smoked in the rain. Somewhere ahead, he felt, this night was going to cost him more than a few hours of sleep. Shadow glanced back at him, then at the woman in red. "Yeah," Evan murmured. "I know. This isn't over." The storm pounded on the roof, demanding to be heard, but inside the little cabin on the edge of Cedar Ridge, something quieter had begun. Jambu. Morning eased into Cedar Ridge with a softness that felt almost dishonest after the brutality of the night before. Pale gold filtered through the cabin windows, stretching across the wooden floorboards and warming the air still smelling faintly of rain. For a long moment, Evan stood at the small stove without moving, listening to the quiet. Not the kind of quiet he knew from lonely nights, but the calm that follows a storm that might have taken a life but didn't. He stirred the oatmeal slowly, mindful not to make too much noise. Margaret Hayes lay on the old sofa beneath a heavy wool blanket, her breathing slow but uneven, as if the storm still clung to the edges of her sleep. Shadow rested beside her, chin on his paws, amber eyes half open and tracking every shift in her breath. The dog had barely slept. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward the door, then toward the window, then back to her. "Easy, bud," Evan murmured. "She's all right." Shadow didn't look convinced. When the fire popped softly, Margaret startled awake. Not violently like she had in the car, but with the kind of jolt that came from years of bracing for the worst. Her eyes flicked around the room until they landed on Shadow, then Evan, and only then did her shoulders begin to lower. "You're safe," Evan said gently, setting a mug of ginger tea on the small table beside her. "Storms moved on." Margaret sat up slowly, her hand brushing across her silver hair as though checking whether it still belonged to her. "I didn't mean to fall asleep," she whispered. "You earned it," Evan replied. "Anyone would after a night like that." She pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders, studying the room like it was a place she wasn't sure she deserved to occupy. "Your cabin is very peaceful," she said softly. It's been a long time since I've felt peace." Shadow lifted his head and nudged her knee. Margaret let out a short, trembling breath that could have been a laugh or the tail end of a sob. "He knew," she murmured, stroking the dog's fur with careful fingers. "Before the car spun, before the thunder hit, he knew something was coming." "Shadow's got instincts most folks don't," Evan said. "Saved my hide more than once overseas." She paused, her expression shifting into something fragile and far away. "That's not what I meant." Her fingers tightened slightly on Shadow's fur. "When he looked at me last night, when the thunder hit, it felt like somebody I used to know was staring through him." Evan pulled out a chair opposite her. "You said a name, Daniel." Her breath caught. For a moment she didn't speak. Then her eyes filled slowly, but she didn't look away. 30 years ago," she said, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire, "I lost my husband and my son in a storm like that. Same kind of thunder, same kind of rain that feels like it wants to tear the world apart." Evan didn't interrupt. Some stories needed space around them. "We were driving back from our anniversary dinner," she continued. "My husband, Charles, was at the wheel. Our son, Michael, had just gotten into a music program he'd dreamed about since he was little. He was 17, too young to die, too young to understand that some storms don't care who they take." She closed her eyes as though reliving it in flashes crueler than lightning. "The truck in front of us hydroplaned. Charles tried to correct it, but the car rolled. I was thrown out. They weren't." Silence fell heavy, almost respectful. Shadow shifted closer, resting his chin gently against her leg. Margaret's fingers trembled as she stroked his ears. "After that night," she whispered, "I couldn't face thunder again without shaking like a leaf. Last night, when the sky cracked open, I was back there. Every sound felt like metal twisting, like losing them all over again." Evan nodded slowly. "Trauma doesn't leave. It just quiets down until something wakes it up." Those words made her look at him with new understanding, as if recognizing a fellow traveler on roads most people don't admit they've walked. "You've lost people, too." He didn't confirm it, but the silence between them did. When she finally sipped the tea, her hand steadied enough to hold the mug without spilling. The morning light softened the lines in her face, revealing a quiet elegance beneath the exhaustion. Her red coat hung neatly on a wooden rack, now dry but still carrying the faint smell of smoke and rain. "How far are we from town?" she asked. "A few miles. I'll take you to the ranger station. You said someone was coming for you?" "My driver. He was hospitalized last night, but the clinic released him this morning." Her voice gained a hint of strength. "I also need to see my attorney today. There are matters that can't wait." Evan didn't pry, but Shadow's ears perked at her tone, as if he sensed a tension beneath her words that she wasn't ready to share. When she stood, her legs wobbled. Evan reached out, steadying her gently. The gesture wasn't intimate, just necessary. She gave him a grateful look that lingered a moment too long. Outside, the world smelled of wet pine and fresh mud. The storm had washed everything clean, except the pieces still stuck inside them. On the ride into town, Margaret rode in silence for the first few minutes, occasionally touching Shadow's head, as though his presence anchored her to something she couldn't yet name. Halfway down the road, she spoke. "You saved my life last night," she said quietly. "I don't have enough words for what that means." "No need for words," Evan replied. "Just glad I was there." "That's the problem," she murmured. "You think helping someone ends with the rescue, but what you did, it doesn't end here." He glanced at her, but she was staring straight ahead, eyes sharpened by a resolve that didn't match her trembling hands. "You don't know who you helped, Evan," she said. "But you will." Shadow let out a single low bark, as if echoing her promise. When they reached the ranger station, a silver sedan waited under the awning. The driver, a thin man with polite eyes, hurried out to assist her. Margaret turned back once more, coat swaying in the morning breeze. "We'll meet again," she said. "Soon. And when we do, things in this town may start changing." Evan watched the car pull away, gravel crunching under the tires, dust rising into the soft spring air. Shadow stood beside him, tail low but alert, watching the sedan disappear around the bend. Evan exhaled a breath he wasn't sure he'd been holding. "You feel it? Too, huh?" he said softly. Shadow answered with a short huff, eyes still fixed on the road. And for the first time since the storm, Evan wondered if rescuing that woman wasn't an ending at all, but the beginning of something that would shake Cedar Ridge in ways he couldn't yet see. Chapo? The morning had settled into a thin gray haze by the time Evan pulled into Ridgeway Auto and Diner. The sign out front flickered like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to stay alive or not, and the smell of old fryer grease drifted across the parking lot. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. Most months, anyway. Shadow hopped out of the truck with a quiet confidence, shaking the last bit of chill from his coat. His ears were up, scanning, as if the peaceful morning didn't fool him one bit. Evan rubbed his head. "Relax, bud," he said, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. "Just a shift, nothing more." He pushed open the back entrance. Inside, the clatter of dishes and low conversation rolled together into the familiar hum of a place already too busy for its own good. But the moment Evan stepped through the doorway, that hum died off in small pockets as a few employees glanced his way. Lena, the young server with tired eyes and a warm heart, offered him a sympathetic smile. "Rough weather, huh?" she said quietly. "Yeah, had to help someone last night," Evan replied. "Took longer than I planned?" Before she could answer, a loud voice cracked across the room like a whip. "Well, look who finally decided to join us." Gary Holt stood near the counter, arms crossed, lips curled into a smirk that never reached his eyes. Gary was the kind of man who pretended he ran the town when he could barely run his shift. His shirt was too tight, his hair too perfect, his pride too fragile. "You're 20 minutes late, Miller," Gary said loudly, glancing around to make sure everyone heard. "I suppose you've got some heroic story lined up for us?" Evan kept his voice even. "An elderly woman crashed her car in the storm. I pulled her out, took her to safety." Lena's hand flew to her mouth. Tom Reyes, the retired Marine working security outside, poked his head in with a slow nod of support. But Gary rolled his eyes dramatically. Right, our local guardian angel. How convenient." He stepped closer, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone. "This place doesn't run on excuses. I don't care who you claim you saved. You show up late, you put everyone behind." Evan felt heat rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. "It wasn't a claim, Gary. There was a crash. I did what any decent—" Gary raised a hand. "Stop. Spare me the sermon." He pulled a clipboard from the counter and clicked his pen with the satisfaction of a man signing someone else's punishment. "This goes in your file. One more hiccup, and you're done." Shadow, sitting quietly near the entrance, emitted a low growl. Not loud, not threatening, just enough that Gary's head snapped in his direction. "You'd better keep that dog under control," Gary snapped. "Last thing I need is him scaring customers." "He's better behaved than most of us," Lena muttered under her breath. But Gary heard it. His glare was sharp enough to cut glass. The rest of the morning passed in a fog of tension. Evan worked the garage bay, oil and steel filling his hands, while Gary hovered like a storm cloud, pointing out imaginary flaws or finding ways to turn small tasks into public criticisms. Evan tried to let it roll off, but Shadow felt every shift in his posture. The dog stayed near the open garage door, watching, listening, the muscles along his back taut. Around noon, Evan stepped outside for a breath of air. The clouds were thinning, leaving behind a sky washed clean by the storm. Tom Reyes leaned against the security booth, arms folded across his broad chest. "Heard Gary giving you a hard time," Tom said. "Man couldn't lead a parade if it was already marching in a straight line." Evan chuckled despite himself. "I'll survive. Just don't know why he's riding me so hard." Tom hesitated, then glanced down the empty side road. "I should tell you something," he said. "Last night, after you dropped off that lady, I saw someone hanging around your truck." Evan stiffened. "Who?" Tom rubbed the back of his neck. Couldn't see clearly, but the size, the shape, looked a hell of a lot like Gary. He had his phone out. Flash was off, but he kept aiming it toward your plates. Shadow let out a soft rumble, tail low. He remembered that scent. "You sure?" Evan asked. "Sure enough to say it wasn't a coincidence," Tom replied. "Man's up to something, and I don't like the smell of it." Evan's jaw tightened. What would he want with my plates? Tom shrugged. "Whatever it is, it ain't good." Before they could say more, the sound of a car engine drifted from the front of the building. A glossy black sedan rolled into the parking lot. Too expensive, too polished, too out of place. It glided to a stop near the entrance of the diner. The rear door opened. Margaret Hayes stepped out. No longer the trembling woman from last night. She wore her red coat with a kind of quiet authority, hair neatly brushed, posture straight despite the lingering exhaustion in her eyes. She was, in every sense, someone people noticed, without knowing why. Lena gasped from inside the diner. Tom straightened. Shadow rose to his feet instantly. Margaret didn't look around. She walked with a measured grace straight toward the entrance, the gravel crunching beneath her heels. Gary emerged from the dining room, mid-scold, voice booming at a server who was near tears. "How many times do I have to—" He stopped when he saw her. The room went still. Customers lifted their heads. Even the fry cook leaned out from the kitchen door. "May I help?" "You?" Gary said, plastering on a smile that cracked around the edges. Margaret set a small woven basket on the counter. "I'm looking for a man named Evan Miller. He works here." Gary blinked. Twice. "Why?" Margaret's voice softened, but her expression sharpened. "Because he saved my life last night, and I came to thank him." Evan stepped inside, Shadow at his heel. The whole diner watched. "There you are," Margaret said gently, relief washing through her voice. "I hoped I'd find you." Gary's face flickered with something sour. "Ma'am, this isn't really—" Margaret didn't even look at him. "Mr. Miller, I understand you were reprimanded this morning." Evan felt the room tighten. "It's fine," he said. "Just bad timing." "No," Margaret replied firmly. "It isn't fine." Her eyes settled on Gary with the calm of a judge who already knew the verdict. "And it won't stay that way?" A murmur rippled through the customers. Margaret gathered her basket again and placed it gently into Evan's hands. "This is only the beginning of my gratitude. Tomorrow morning I will return, and I expect to speak with senior management present." Gary's smile vanished. "Now hold on, just—" Margaret turned away without waiting for him to finish, her presence cutting through the diner like a clean wind. Evan watched her walk back toward her waiting car, each step precise, deliberate. Shadow watched her too, ears perked, tail still, eyes thoughtful. When the sedan drove off, Evan stood frozen for a moment, basket in hand, heart thudding with a mix of confusion and dread. Tom let out a low whistle. "Son, you just kicked a hornet's nest without even trying." Evan exhaled slowly. "Feels like the storm followed me to work." Shadow brushed against his leg, gaze fixed on the direction Margaret's car had disappeared. And for the second time in 2 days, Evan felt the ground shift under him, quietly but unmistakably, like the first roll of thunder before anyone looks up at the sky. The next morning, Cedar Ridge woke to a kind of uneasy quiet, the kind that follows news that spreads faster than truth can catch up. Word of the woman in the red coat showing up at Ridgeway Auto and Diner had already made its rounds by sunrise. Folks at the bakery whispered about her sharp tone. The clerk at the hardware store claimed she carried herself like somebody who owned half the county. And by the time Evan walked Shadow toward town, people were looking at him differently, curious, cautious, like he'd stepped into a story they hadn't heard the ending of yet. "Strange morning," Evan murmured, patting Shadow's shoulder. The dog didn't relax. His ears stayed angled forward, nose constantly sampling the wind. "Yeah, I feel it too," Evan said under his breath. When they turned the corner onto Main Street, he spotted 2 council members talking behind the old post office. Councilman Briggs, tall and stiff like he'd been carved out of chalk, leaned close to a shorter man with a nervous habit of wringing his hands. The moment Briggs saw Evan, he straightened abruptly. Both men went silent until he passed. Shadow cast a long look over his shoulder. Briggs didn't appreciate the stare. Inside the diner, things were just as tense. The breakfast crowd was thin, voices muted, eyes flicking between their plates and the doorway. Lena approached cautiously, a pot of coffee hugged against her apron. "Morning, Evan," she said softly. "You all right? Folks have been talking." "Let 'em talk," he said, though the knot in his stomach tightened. "I just want to get through the day." Lena hesitated. "Gary's been in a mood. Worse than usual. Keeps going on about meetings and chain of command. Think he's nervous." "He should be," muttered a voice behind her. Tom Reyes strode in from the parking lot, shaking cold air from his uniform jacket. He leaned toward Evan. Briggs has been lurking around since dawn. Saw him meeting with a corporate rep out by the gas pumps. Something's brewing. Before Evan could respond, Gary burst out of his office, waving a clipboard like he was flagging down a passing train. "Miller! Office! Now!" Evan stepped forward, Shadow falling into place beside him with a steady, protective gait. Gary's eyes twitched at the sight of the dog. "Leave the mud out here," Gary snapped. "He stays," Evan said. Gary opened his mouth to argue, but thought better of it. He walked stiffly back into his office, muttering under his breath. The office smelled like stale coffee and cheap cologne. Paperwork was stacked in chaotic piles across the desk, each pile a monument to Gary's disorganization. He shut the door halfway, not enough for privacy, just enough for drama. "So," Gary began, leaning back in his chair with a smirk he hadn't earned, "seems you've made some interesting friends. Fancy ones." "Is there a point to this?" Evan asked. Gary tapped the clipboard with one finger. "People like her don't just show up for grease monkeys. You expect me to believe she's here out of gratitude? Please, she's connected to that development deal. The land sale, the new distribution center, you know? Real decisions." Shadow growled low. Gary pretended not to hear it. Evan's brow tightened. "What are you talking about?" Gary blinked with exaggerated innocence. "You mean you don't know? The company's been negotiating a sale. This whole property, garage, diner, gas lot, could become a warehouse hub. Big money. And some of us," he said, tapping his own chest, "have been working hard to make sure the right people get their cut." Evan's stomach dropped. "People like Briggs." Gary's smile slipped. "Careful." Before Evan could speak again, a voice echoed through the diner with startling clarity. "Where is he?" Every head in the place turned. Standing at the entrance, wrapped in a forest green coat this time, was Margaret Hayes, straight-backed, elegant, calm in ways that felt rehearsed over a lifetime. Gary froze. Margaret stepped forward, her heels clicking across the floor with the precise rhythm of someone who had spent decades being listened to. "Mr. Miller," she said warmly, "I hoped you'd be here." Evan blinked. "Mrs. Hayes, I didn't expect—" "I know, that's the problem." She turned to the room, her gaze sweeping across customers and staff with polite acknowledgement before landing on Gary with surgical precision. "We need to talk," she said, not loudly, but with a tone that carried further than any shout. Gary swallowed hard. "Ma'am, this isn't—" "Tomorrow," she said calmly, "I will be meeting with upper management and the town council. There are matters that require transparency. I expect you to be present." Gary's face went pale. What matters?" "The kind," Margaret replied, "that prefer daylight." A murmur rippled through the diner. Someone dropped a fork. Someone else whispered, "Lord help him." She turned to Evan. "Thank you again for last night, and for this morning, considering how you've been treated." Shadow stepped closer to her, sniffing her coat as though confirming she was unharmed. Margaret's hand drifted to the dog's head almost instinctively. "You have remarkable instincts," she whispered to Shadow. "Both of you do?" And then she left, just as swiftly as she had come. The moment the door shut behind her, Gary stormed back into his office, slamming the door with a force that rattled the windows. But fear had cracked through his bravado, and everyone could see it. Briggs' face, pressed against the glass as he peered in from outside, wasn't much steadier. Lena approached Evan with wide eyes. What on earth is going on? Why would a woman like her come here twice in 2 days? Evan didn't answer right away. Shadow leaned into his leg, solid as stone. "I don't know," Evan said finally. "But whatever it is, tomorrow's going to be one hell of a day." Tom let out a low whistle. "Son, she just lit a fire under this whole town." Evan stared through the diner window toward the road Margaret had disappeared down, feeling something shift beneath his feet again, bigger this time, heavier, like the rumble before a quake. Shadow's ears flicked, nose lifting to catch a scent on the wind. And deep in Evan's gut, a cold certainty settled. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. Night settled over Cedar Ridge with a strange metallic stillness, the kind that sinks into the gaps between houses and waits. Evan felt it the moment he and Shadow stepped out of the diner after closing. The cold air bit through his jacket, sharper than it should have been for early spring. Shadow stayed close, unusually alert, his ears shifting at every rustle of wind. "Easy," Evan murmured, patting the dog's shoulder. "Long day. We're heading home." But Shadow didn't ease. His nose lifted toward the dark stretch of road, catching something Evan couldn't see or smell. A warning rumbled low in his chest. They reached the gravel drive leading to Evan's small rental house. The porch light flickered weakly. Halfway up the path, Shadow froze. His body stiffened, tail lowered, muscles coiled like a wire pulled too tight. "What is it, boy?" Evan whispered. Then he saw it, a faint glint near the mailbox, just enough to catch the moonlight. A silhouette bent low, arm extended, a phone pointed at Evan's truck. The screen glow lit the man's face from beneath, making his features look hollow and strained. Shadow erupted into a bark so sharp it cracked through the night like a gunshot. The man jerked in panic, dropping the phone. He spun toward Evan, his breath puffing white in the cold. Gary Holt. Of all the people Evan expected to see stalking around his house in the dark, Gary wasn't on the list, not the top 5 at least. Evan stepped forward, keeping his voice steady. "Gary? What the hell are you doing here?" Gary stumbled backward, hands shaking. I was just... This isn't... He swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the street like a trapped animal searching for an escape. I was checking something for a report. I needed to confirm a detail." "By photographing my plates in the middle of the night?" Evan asked. "At my house?" "That's none of your business," Gary snapped, but the words cracked instead of landing. He took another shaky step back as Shadow growled again. "Call off the dog." "He's reacting to you," Evan said, "and I gotta say, he's usually right." Gary's face twitched. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Saving people, walking around like you're better than the rest of us?" His eyes gleamed with something wild and brittle. "You don't know anything about people in this town, not what they're capable of, not what they've already decided about you." "Meaning what?" Evan asked. Gary flinched at his own bravado and spun around, practically fleeing into the shadows. "Stay away from me," he barked over his shoulder. "I'll have proof. You just wait." He disappeared down the sidewalk, footsteps fading into the quiet. Shadow kept barking until the darkness swallowed Gary whole. Evan knelt, steadying the dog. "Easy. It's all right. He's gone." But Shadow's posture said it wasn't all right, not even close. That's when something near Evan's boot glinted again. Shadow nudged it with his nose. Evan crouched and picked it up, a small black USB drive, cold from the ground, scratched along one side. "What were you doing with this, Gary?" Evan murmured. Inside the house, the quiet felt heavy. Evan set the USB beside his old laptop on the kitchen table. Shadow paced. Once, twice, then settled at Evan's feet, head resting near the chair leg like a guard dog on duty. Evan slid the USB into the port. Nothing happened for a moment. Then a folder blinked onto the screen. Kitchen archives, safety reports. His stomach tightened. He clicked the first file. A video opened, a grainy shot of the diner's kitchen. Evan saw himself at the grill, moving between burners. But something was off. The clip sputtered, frames jumping unnaturally. Then suddenly, a flash of fire erupted near the corner of the stove. Except Evan remembered that shift. There had been no flare-up. He clicked the next file. This time the oven alarmed loudly, smoke billowing from a tray that appeared charred. Evan watched himself yank the tray out, while other employees ran around in chaos. Except that never happened either. A third file. A grease fire, loud, exaggerated, licking up past the hood vent. Also fake. Each video was sliced, rearranged, stitched together. Sloppy in some parts, shockingly careful in others. It was designed to paint him as careless, unstable, dangerous. "Someone wants me fired," Evan whispered. "Hell, maybe worse." Shadow whined softly and pressed closer to him, trembling with something that wasn't fear. Something older. "Buddy?" Evan said quietly. "You okay?" Shadow didn't react to Evan's voice. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, on the flicker of fire edited over Evan's movements. When a distorted crackle of explosion sounded in one of the clips, Shadow jerked, muscles rippling, a deep whine escaping his throat. Evan froze. "That sound," he whispered. "They used it overseas, didn't they? That frequency?" Shadow whined again, confirming it. Someone had embedded psychological triggers into the footage. Sounds meant to induce panic in trained K9s, and in some cases, their handlers. "Gary doesn't know anything about this," Evan said, more to himself than the dog. "He's too sloppy, too impulsive." He leaned closer to the screen. "This is someone else's handiwork, someone who knows how to break a person without touching them." Shadow nudged his hand, urging him away from the laptop, as if the machine itself were dangerous. "I know, boy," Evan murmured, "but we need answers." He scrolled through the file directory. Dozens of edited clips, dozens more flagged with dates and labels that matched times he knew he hadn't been near the kitchen. This wasn't just sabotage. It was a campaign. Someone wanted him gone, discredited, destroyed. A soft knock sounded at the door. Shadow stood instantly, body rigid. Evan moved to the door, cracked it, and found Tom Reyes standing there with a worried look etched deep into his weathered face. "Evening," Tom said quietly. "You up?" "Yeah," Evan replied. "I think something's happening, Tom. Something bad." Tom stepped inside, shutting the cold out behind him. "I came because, well, Briggs and Gary were meeting again after shift, whispering like devils. And Gary looked spooked, more than usual." Evan nodded toward the laptop. "I know why." He explained everything, the videos, Gary outside his house, the edited evidence, the strange audio triggers. Tom watched in stunned silence, jaw tight. When Evan finished, he exhaled slowly. "This isn't just some petty grudge. Someone's trying to ruin your life, son." Evan leaned back against the table. "Sheriff Collins needs to see this, before the meeting tomorrow." Tom shook his head. "No, not just the sheriff." His eyes hardened. "This needs to be brought out into the open. If you walk into that meeting blind, they'll gut you like a fish." Shadow padded closer, brushing against Evan's leg, steady and present, his silent promise that Evan wasn't facing this alone. Evan closed the laptop, pulse heavy. "All right. Tomorrow we bring it all. The truth, every piece." Tom nodded. "You ready for that kind of fight?" Evan looked down at Shadow, whose amber eyes glowed with fierce loyalty. "I've seen worse storms," he said, "but this one's coming for me, with intent." Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the porch with a low, hollow sound. Not thunder, not yet, but close. Morning light washed across the Northwood Corporate Center, turning the frost on the windows into thin silver veins. It should have been a normal workday, the kind where people carried coffee cups and worried about spreadsheets. But the building felt tense, brittle, like the hours before a storm. Evan felt it the second he stepped inside, with Shadow at his heel. Tom Reyes walked beside them, shoulders squared, like he was escorting a man into a courtroom rather than a meeting. "You ready?" Tom asked quietly. "No," Evan answered honestly, "but we're here." Shadow pressed his head gently against his leg, a steady anchor in a world that had tilted sideways. The conference room was bigger than Evan expected. Long oak table, chairs arranged like it was a trial. And in many ways, it was. Sheriff Collins stood near the windows, flipping through a notepad. His nod toward Evan was firm but grim. A few corporate representatives sat clustered near the far end, whispering over documents. Councilman Briggs hovered near the coffee tray, pale as though he hadn't slept. Gary Holt arrived last, tugging nervously at his too-tight shirt, face slick with anxious sweat. When he saw Evan sitting calmly beside Shadow, something unsettled flickered behind his eyes. Fear or guilt or both. But the room shifted when Margaret Hayes appeared in the doorway. She wore her red coat again, not out of vanity, but intent. Every step she took felt deliberate, a woman stepping into a moment she had prepared for. Conversations died mid-word. Even Briggs straightened like a schoolboy caught cheating. "Good morning," Margaret said, voice warm but edged with steel. "Shall we begin?" Everyone took their seats. Shadow settled beside Evan, tail still, eyes scanning the room with soldierly discipline. Nolan Brooks, the regional director, cleared his throat and spoke first. "We've gathered to address allegations of falsified safety incidents, misconduct, and wrongful termination claims involving Mr. Evan Miller." Gary's jaw tightened. He raised his hand. "Before we let this spiral—" "We'll let the evidence speak," Nolan interrupted. Margaret folded her hands. "Play the USB, please." A technician connected Evan's drive to the projector. The first video flickered onto the wall. The room grew colder. Evan watched his own face move through the fake kitchen footage. The glitches, the staged flare-ups, the smoke edited into places that had been perfectly calm. And underneath it, faint but audible, the distorted pop of explosive echoes. The same sound Shadow reacted to. A murmur rippled through the table. One manager leaned forward, squinting. "The timestamps jump, the shadows don't line up." "Lighting's wrong, too," another said. "This is doctored." Gary's face drained to ash. "Now hold on, these are legitimate clips." "Really?" Sheriff Collins cut in. "Because the logbook from your shift patterns doesn't match anything in these videos, and your signature appears on nights you weren't even present." Briggs swallowed hard. His collar seemed too tight now. Evan opened a folder and pushed printed photos forward. "These were left at my house last night," he said. "Same phone Gary used outside my driveway, same angles, and the USB he dropped." Gasps circled the room. Gary shot to his feet. "This is insane! I was framed. I didn't. Briggs told me." Briggs nearly choked. "Don't drag me into this." "Oh, you dragged yourself," Margaret said suddenly. She opened a slim leather binder and laid out several printed emails, clean, crisp, damning. "These," she continued calmly, "are correspondences between Mr. Briggs and Mr. Holt, discussing how to remove Mr. Miller to expedite the sale of this property, splitting your commission, and labeling him as unstable to justify termination without legal risk." Briggs collapsed back into his chair. Gary looked like he might faint. Nolan turned to them slowly. "Is this true?" Neither answered. They didn't need to. Then Shadow stood, not barking, not growling. He simply stepped forward and placed one paw firmly on Evan's boot. The gesture was subtle, but in the silence of the room it landed like a declaration. Margaret exhaled, her expression softening. "This dog," she said, "knew the truth before any of us." Tom spoke next. "I've worked security 10 years. I've never seen a man more steady than Evan Miller. If these two weren't so busy trying to ruin his life, you'd all know that too." Nolan nodded. "Sheriff, I assume you're opening an investigation?" "Already have," Collins replied. "Charges will follow." Gary's voice cracked as he tried one last defense. This woman doesn't even work here? Why is she allowed?" Margaret stood slowly. "For one," she said, "because I was the woman Mr. Miller saved during the storm you keep dismissing." Her voice grew colder. "And second, because as of yesterday, I acquired a controlling share of this regional branch." The room erupted in shock. "I'm here," she finished, "because I protect people who protect others." Nolan folded his hands. "Mr. Holt, Mr. Briggs, you are suspended effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Gary's knees buckled. Briggs didn't move at all, as though his bones had turned to dust. As they were led from the room, Margaret turned to Evan with a warmth that cut through the tension like sunlight through cloud. "This," she said softly, "is only the first part of my thank you." Evan lowered his gaze, overwhelmed. Shadow leaned into his leg, steady as ever. The meeting ended, leaving a strange hush in its wake, the hush of things ending and things beginning at the same time. Outside, the sky was bright and clear, as if the storm had blown its last breath. But Margaret paused at the doorway, glancing back once more. "We have more to discuss, Mr. Miller," she said, "about Cedar Ridge, and about your future." Then she left, her red coat trailing behind her like a banner carried into battle. Evan stood there, Shadow beside him, heart beating with something he had not felt in a long, long time. Hope. Ton nouveaux. The days after the explosive meeting moved strangely in Cedar Ridge, quiet on the surface, unsettled underneath, like the town itself was holding its breath. Word spread quickly. Gary and Briggs were suspended, the property sale halted, and Evan Miller once just the quiet mechanic with the loyal dog, now stood at the center of a scandal bigger than he ever asked for. People who hadn't looked him in the eye for months suddenly found excuses to speak to him, shake his hand, thank him for standing up for what's right. Evan didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man caught in the undertow of a storm he never saw coming. Shadow, however, moved through those days with steady purpose. More alert, more protective, as if he sensed that whatever had begun the night of the thunderstorm was still unfolding. 3 evenings later, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and washed the sky in amber, Evan found Margaret Hayes waiting on the porch of his cabin. She looked smaller somehow, not weaker, just quieter. Her red coat draped around her like a memory, and the soft breeze lifted the silver strands of her hair. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "You're never interrupting," Evan answered. "Come inside. Shadow's been waiting for you." Indeed, the dog had risen the moment she came into view, tail sweeping the floor in slow, gentle arcs. He trotted toward her, nudged her hand, then stayed pressed at her side as if guiding her inside the cabin. It made her smile, but the smile carried an ache. "I wanted to speak with you privately," she said as she settled into the old armchair by the fire. "Away from the noise, away from all the people who now want to pretend they always cared." Evan nodded, sitting across from her. Shadow lay down between them, paws crossed, alert in a calm way. Margaret took a long breath, bracing herself. "There is something I need to tell you, Evan. Something you deserve to hear." He leaned forward. "You can tell me anything. My doctors," she began carefully, "believe I won't see many more winters." The words landed like a dull blow. Evan's chest tightened. "Margaret." She lifted a hand, gentle but firm. "Please let me finish." He fell silent. "I have a heart condition," she continued. "It's been managed for years, but age has its way. I've had spells, recent ones. The night of the storm wasn't the first time I felt my heart falter, but it was the closest it's come to giving out entirely." Shadow whined softly and rested his head on her knee. She touched his fur, eyes bright but steady. "That night," she said, "when you and Shadow pulled me from that car, I realized something. I've lived through so much loss, Evan. Buried my husband, buried my son, spent decades convincing myself that suffering was the only thing I had left to give the world. But you—" She paused, swallowing. "You gave me back time, a little bit of life. Enough to put things in order." Evan didn't know what to say, so he didn't. He let the room stay quiet. Margaret reached for her bag and placed a thick envelope on the table between them. The seal was unbroken, heavy, official. "This is my estate plan," she said softly. "Revised this week. It includes my home, my financial accounts, and the majority of my personal assets." Evan blinked, stunned. "Margaret, I can't—" "You can," she said, "and you will, not for me, for Cedar Ridge." He frowned in confusion. Margaret continued. "The land that Briggs and Gary wanted to sell, including the garage, the old lumber warehouse, and the empty lot behind the creek. I own it, all of it. My husband bought it decades ago when land was cheap. I kept it because it meant something to him. Now it needs to mean something again." She leaned forward, her voice steadying with purpose. "I want you to take it. Use it. Build something better than what those men planned." "What kind of something?" Evan asked, breath unsteady. "A center," she said. "A place where people can find their footing again. Veterans, folks who lost their jobs, young people who need a trade and someone to believe in them. And maybe," she added with a soft look at Shadow, "a K-9 training program. Dogs like him change lives. People like you do too." Evan felt a weight in his throat. Couldn't quite swallow. "I'm no leader, Margaret." "You are exactly what this town needs," she said. steady hands, a good heart. And Shadow? He's more than a dog. He's a compass. Shadow nudged Evan's arm as if backing her up. Margaret sat back, exhaustion touching the corners of her mouth. My whole life, I've watched storms tear things apart. It's time to build something that withstands them. Evan stared at the envelope, at her, at Shadow. Why me? She smiled, soft, sad, full of truth. Because you stopped when no one else did. Because you looked at a stranger in the rain and saw a human being worth saving. That's rare, Evan, rarer than money, rarer than land. The fire crackled softly, its glow dancing across the floor. She reached out her hand. Evan took it lightly, aware of how frail her fingers felt. You saved me, she whispered. This is my thank you. Shadow lifted his head and placed one paw gently on her arm. The gesture froze her breath. She looked into the dog's eyes, deep, knowing, steady, and tears rose before she could stop them. My son, she whispered. He looked at me like that, just like that. Evan's heart clenched. Shadow didn't move, didn't blink. He simply sat there, offering a presence that held more comfort than words ever could. Margaret took another shaking breath. Promise me, Evan, promise me you'll use what I leave to lift others. He squeezed her hand. I promise. Only then did she let go of the envelope. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. But inside the cabin, something quiet and powerful shifted, like the moment a storm breaks not with thunder, but with the first glimmer of light behind it. Evan looked at the envelope again, and realized Margaret's thank you wasn't a simple gesture of gratitude. It was a turning point. For him, for Shadow, for Cedar Ridge. Spring crept into Cedar Ridge slowly, as if unsure whether the town was ready for gentler days. The last traces of winter frost clung stubbornly to the north side of rooftops, but the creek ran faster, the pines smelled greener, and the morning air held a softness no one had felt in months. Evan felt the change too, not in the weather, but in the way people nodded at him on Main Street, in how conversations paused with gratitude instead of suspicion, in the way Shadow now walked through town like he belonged to everyone. And maybe he did. Folks swore the dog could sense trouble before it came, and after everything that happened, no one doubted it. But alongside the warmth of spring came a quiet ache that lived in Evan's chest. He saw Margaret frequently in the weeks following her confession, her strength flickering like a candle caught in a draught. Some days she walked the grounds of her property with him, pointing to buildings and whispering their histories. Other days she sat in his cabin near the fire, Shadow curled protectively at her feet while she spoke of her son, her husband, and a life heavy with both privilege and heartbreak. Then, one soft morning, Margaret didn't answer her door. Evan found her lying beside her bed, her red coat half draped across the quilt as if she'd tried to reach it. The world went quiet, in a way no storm had ever managed. Shadow pressed his nose into her shoulder, then let out a sound Evan had never heard from him, a low, mournful whine that seemed to say goodbye for both of them. The doctor said it was peaceful. Her heart had simply run out of time. Her funeral was small by her request. A handful of neighbors, a few distant relatives, and those whose lives she had touched quietly over the years. People who had never known she was the anonymous sponsor of scholarships, medical bills, and holiday food drives. People who had never known her name but felt her absence immediately. Evan stood near the lake with Shadow at his side while the pastor spoke. A warm breeze rippled across the water, carrying the faint scent of pine and spring bloom. Margaret would have liked that, he thought. She always said the lake felt like a mirror that forgave more than it reflected. Shadow rested his head against Evan's leg and stayed there until the last prayer faded. After the service, Nolan Brooks approached Evan with a thick envelope. "She left instructions," he said quietly, "and a final letter for you." His voice softened. You meant more to her than she ever said out loud." Evan took the envelope with steady hands that didn't feel steady at all. That night, sitting at the small kitchen table of his cabin, he opened it. Inside were the legal documents, proof of everything Margaret had promised: the land, the funds, the rights to the old lumber warehouse and the empty garage lot. And at the very bottom, her handwriting in looping, elegant strokes: "From the night you pulled me from the storm, you and Shadow became the family I thought I had lost forever. Build something good, Evan. Something that outlives us both." Margaret Evan sat for a long time without moving. Shadow nudged his arm gently, then laid his head in Evan's lap as if reminding him he wasn't alone. And that was how the idea became a plan. Over the next months, Cedar Ridge watched as the old garage was stripped down, repainted, rebuilt. The abandoned lumber warehouse was cleaned out, windows restored, floors replaced. Volunteers showed up, some because they believed in Evan, some because they believed in Margaret's legacy, and some because they finally believed the town deserved better than the scraps it had been fed. Tom Reyes headed security and renovations. Lena organized community meals for the workers. Veterans from nearby towns arrived offering help, eager for purpose. Even Sheriff Collins showed up on his days off with a toolbox slung under one arm. And in the center of it all, Evan worked dawn to dusk. Shadow never more than a few steps away. By early summer, the sign went up: Storm Haven Center, in honor of Margaret Hayes. It wasn't fancy, hand-carved by a retired carpenter whose pension didn't stretch far, but people cried when it was lifted into place. On opening day, the entire town gathered. The sun shone bright but not harsh, the breeze warm enough to carry voices across the lot. Children laughed near the refurbished courtyard. Veterans stood straighter than they had in years. Folks lined up to tour the job training workshop, the community dining room, and, most popular of all, the fenced K-9 training field where Shadow demonstrated obedience drills with calm, patient confidence. When Evan stepped onto the small wooden stage, the crowd fell quiet. Shadow sat beside him, tail sweeping once across the planks. "I didn't build this alone," Evan began. "Truth is, I didn't build it at all. Margaret did. She believed we deserved a place that could weather storms, real ones and the kind people carry inside." He paused, steadying his breath. "She gave us a future because she wanted to say thank you, not just to me, but to all of you." He glanced at Shadow, who looked up at him with those calm, knowing eyes. "She once told me storms aren't here to take from us," Evan continued. "Sometimes they bring people together. Sometimes they give us a second chance. I think she was right." The crowd stirred, some wiping their eyes, some nodding solemnly. After the applause faded, after the tours ended, after the sun sank low and families headed home, Evan found a quiet moment near the lake behind the center. The water shimmered with gold from the setting sky, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of summer grass. He sat on the old dock, legs dangling over the edge. Shadow settled beside him, leaning into his shoulder with warm, solid weight. Evan looked out at the calm water and said softly, "Didn't think pulling someone out of a storm could lead to all this, buddy." Shadow let out a slow exhale, as if agreeing. Evan chuckled under his breath, the sound tinged with something tender. "Guess Margaret knew better than either of us." A single bird sang from a nearby pine. Then the world went still in the way only peaceful places do. The storm that had begun it all was long gone, but its blessing remained in every hammer swing during the renovations, in every person who found work again, in every meal shared, in every stray dog Shadow helped train, and in every quiet moment when Evan felt the grace of a life rebuilt from one night's compassion. He rested a hand on Shadow's back. "Come on," he said softly. Let's go home." And together, man and dog, they walked across the field toward the warm lights of Stormhaven Center, a place born from a storm, shaped by a thank you, and carried forward by the people who finally saw its meaning. The town would tell the story for years. He pulled an old woman from the storm, and her thank, "You changed everything." Orati? If this story touched your heart, let me know by dropping a simple 1 in the comments. It's an easy way to tell me you're here, listening, and walking through these journeys with us. And if you'd like more gentle, heartfelt stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these moments alive, and I'd be honored to have you with us for the next chapter. Thank you for being here.